You're listening to Building the Broncos with Nick Kendell and Carl Dumler, Broncos Country's leading draft and scouting analysts. Get on over to milehighhuddle.com to sound off on all things Broncos.
Hello there, Broncos Country, and it is once again time for another episode of Building the Broncos. I'm your host, Carl Dumler, and with me, as always, I have Nick Kendell. Joining me today also, we have Mr. Mark Schofield. Gentlemen, how's it going out there?
Gentlemen, always great to be with you, Carl, Nick. Excited to talk about these quarterbacks. It's going to be a fun little discussion, interesting quarterback class, and it's always great to be with you guys.
Yeah, thanks for coming on today, Mark. Always appreciate your insight. And this is turning into the Quarterback Watch podcast, from Joe Flacco, Case Keenum, all the quarterbacks last year to this year. I mean, always getting that reputation of a quarterback collector. But, hey, most important position in American sports. And if you don't got one, you're going to be constantly looking. So as a draft podcast, that's just what it is.
Yeah, I mean, it's a position that you got to get right. Otherwise, you're going to keep trying to get it right, and that can send teams down some bad roads. So until you get that spot fixed, you're going to be looking for that guy.
Yeah, I wrote an article today on just the quarterback dilemma. That's, people in Denver are losing their darn minds about it, and just a little bit of perspective. I mean, Peyton Manning was playing here 3-4 years ago, and he wasn't the same at the end. That's true. But you look at a team like the Browns, and how many years was it from Bernie Kosar to frickin' Baker Mayfield? I mean, it can get much worse. So
yeah, I mean, we all know that image that basically it's a meme now of that Browns jersey with all the names of the starting quarterbacks over the years, and it's just like a CVS receipt, like down the hallway and into another wing of the house. And so, be thankful you're not at least in that boat.
Not yet. Knock on wood. Maybe they'll figure it out this draft. Fingers crossed. We'll see there. Yeah, you got a little bit lucky over there. Covering I wouldn't call it lucky. You got Bill Belichick and Brady. There's no real luck involved there. I mean, 6th round pick, but still, it's definitely living the life of leisure when you got that combo.
Yeah, I mean, I've said it before on my show, and I've told this to like friends and family and things like that. When those guys retire, Patriots fans, we will be wandering the desert of football purgatory, I'd imagine, and it might be well-deserved. I'd imagine 31 other fan bases feel it will be well-deserved because we've been pretty lucky over the past basically 2 decades with those two guys in town.
An unprecedented run, a dynasty, no matter how you slice it up, in the salary cap era. I don't think we'll ever see something like it again. And the only thing that, helps me sleep at night is that it's going to be over one day. And that day is probably coming. I mean, who knows, but maybe one day.
That's what we keep saying every year.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure that people were saying that back when they lost, in 2007, this will be the end of them, or when they lost to the Giants the second time, like, they'll never get back. So, maybe eventually those people like Rob Parker and, Max Kellerman, eventually they're going to be right. Brady will hit that cliff and, they can take their victory laps maybe a decade later, but they'll be able to take those laps eventually.
You guys will end up trading for Josh Rosen or some BS because the Cardinals will get Kyler Murray, and then it'll be a seamless transition, and we'll all be like, well, man, this stinks.
I mean, crazier things have happened. We can just say that.
That's for sure.
Well, Mark, how about you let us know a little bit of your background and maybe where our listeners can find some of your work, because even though you are a Patriots guy, you are that quarterback expert, and like Nick said, Broncos are constantly looking for a quarterback. Until you find one, you're always looking for one.
Well, I can tell you one place you won't find one, and that's here with me, because I was a failed quarterback in college, which now allows me to write about the position with, I don't want to say any authority, but it makes it sound like I know what I'm talking about. Best places to find me at Mark Schofield on Twitter, write for places like Inside the Pylon, Pro Football Weekly, The Score, Matt Waldman's Rookie Scouting Portfolio, a couple different SB Nation websites, a few different podcasts, whether it's a Locked On Patriots podcast or the QB SCO show over at Bleeding Green Nation with my co-host Michael Kiss, where we talk about quarterbacks all the time. And so, this is kind of what I do, is start studying quarterbacks, once this draft ends. And actually, guys, believe it or not, in a couple of weeks, I'm going to start watching guys for the 2020 class. That's kind of my time frame. Last summer, I watched 40 guys to get ready for this draft class, and there's always some carryover. I mean, I had years of tape, for example, on Drew Lock to study him, because I watched him 2 summers ago. And so this is all I do. I read, eat, sleep, and study quarterbacks. And it makes me boring at parties, but it makes me, I'd say, sometimes a decent podcast guest. We'll put it that way.
Hey man, you can come over to my place. We'll play some Catan. We'll nerd it up, and we'll talk quarterbacks all day.
That sounds like fun to me.
Share some good craft beers from Iowa. That's the life.
All right. Well, make sure to find Nick and I both on Twitter. You can find Nick at Nick Kendell MHH. You can find me at Carl Dumler MHH. You can follow the podcast Twitter account at BTB Football Pod, and make sure you subscribe to our show and leave us a rating, as we value your input on our show. You can find the show on iTunes, Stitcher, and even that of YouTube. Also, make sure you head over to Mile High Huddle, an affiliate of 24/7 Sports and the CBS Sports Digital, to find ours and our co-writers' articles and all things pertain to your Denver Broncos. And know that this podcast is powered by Overtime Media. Now, before we get to all of our content today, talking about all the quarterbacks in this draft and Joe Flacco, first we want to take a quick break.
This is the Overtime Podcast Network.
Well, on our podcast, all of you listeners know we've talked about the big three quarterbacks: Drew Lock, Dwayne Haskins, Kyler Murray, probably ad nauseum. You're probably tired of hearing their names a little bit. And so we kind of wanted to have Mark on here because he's, like he said, he was already watching 40 quarterbacks preparing for this draft. And so that means that if there's anybody that knows about the guys beyond the top guys, this is our man. And that's what we want to do here today, is have him kind of break down what happens if the Broncos don't go quarterback in the first round. Are there some guys that they can look at that maybe could have some potential in the future? And the very first guy, and then he's kind of he's a well-known guy because he's usually listed as that number 4 or number 5 guy, depending on who you talk to. But Daniel Jones of Duke, and he was at the Senior Bowl. Mark, were you down at the Senior Bowl?
I was down at Mobile, 4th year in a row. Always a fun time.
Yeah, I loved when I was down there. I missed it this year, and I was very, very sad. Right before you came on, actually, I was telling Nick how much I was upset with myself for not going this year. But
Mobile is a fun town, and the Senior Bowl is always a good event.
It is. And so you got to see Daniel Jones up close. You've got to watch his tape, obviously. What do you look at as maybe some strengths and weaknesses of his games, things that can really especially translate to the NFL level?
Well, it's interesting, Carl, that you brought up the Senior Bowl, because I thought that was going to be a perfect week for him. It was set up very nicely for him. And part of the reason is when you study him on film, whether it's a couple years ago, last year's tape, this year's tape, what really sort of jumped out to me was the quick game stuff, the West Coast type stuff, whether it's, process and speed on those plays, which is very good. The ball placement in those short area throws, slants, hitches, quick outs, things like that. They showed up on tape over and over again. He constantly had that ability to put the throw where it needed to be, to give his receivers a chance to get yardage after the catch. And so I really like him as sort of a West Coast type fit from an offensive scheme standpoint. And when you think about what he was going to do down at the Senior Bowl, he was going to be playing for John Gruden, sort of Mr. West Coast. And so I thought that week was set up extremely well for him to go down, have the kind of week you might have been hoping for, where he could make that sort of leap up, maybe even surpass a Drew Lock, for example. Establish himself as this is a guy that's going to get drafted in the first round. He looks the part, he looks the bill, big, strong, athletic, decent enough arm. But he sort of really left me underwhelmed during Senior Bowl week. And I think the best way to sort of outline how that week went down for him was Wednesday's practice. It was closed to the media because there were storms in the area, thunderstorms all day long. So they only had it in a field house for South Alabama University, and there was only enough room for 1 or 2 people from each team to attend practices. And so we didn't get to see the Wednesday practices until later that night on film. And so I watched the 7-on-7 portions. Again, it's your second day of practice, so now you're kind of on the same page. You've got a decent enough feel for those receivers you're going to be throwing to. And in 7-on-7, look, there's no pass rush, there's no pressure, blitz, anything like that. Very controlled situation, so you should be able to do pretty well at this point. And his first throws during that drill was a quick out to the left. Again, something he likes to throw and throws very well. He missed it by like 5 feet. His second throw was a check down to the left flat to his running back that he stared at way too long, double clutched on it, I think even, and threw a pick six. And then the third throw was a comeback route along the left sideline. Maybe he just has an issue throwing to his left, at least on that day. His receiver falls down. He triple clutches on it and throws a pick six. And that's one of those sort of put the pen down moments, like I've seen enough. I don't need to go down the road anymore. So, not to read too much into, just 3 plays, but when you study him outside of the West Coast realm, it gets a bit shaky. I thought this was, again, a week that was set up for him, and he underwhelmed. And so I'm not like fully out on Daniel Jones or anything like that. But, if you're seeing mock drafts, for example, I saw a mock draft with, him coming off the board at 32 to New England. There are some quarterbacks we'll talk about that I'd rather get in the third or fourth rounds that I will have ranked higher than Daniel Jones on my board, that I would rather get in the third or fourth round than Daniel Jones at 32. I think there are teams that are going to like him. We are hearing going into the combine that some teams have him quarterback 1, quarterback 2. I get that. He's safe. He looks the part. If you draft him in the first round, you're probably not getting fired if he busts. But when I'm putting together my board and when I'm seeing him on film and some of the stuff we saw down to the Senior Bowl as well, I'm not that impressed.
Does that connection to Daniel Cutcliffe get really overblown?
I think so. Because, who are the quarterbacks that he is most known for working with? Eli Manning and Peyton Manning, okay? I think those guys could have been coached by my cat and been pretty successful. And conversely, if I went to play for Cutcliffe, he wasn't going to turn me into a great quarterback. Now, if he had done something like that, then we could probably say, look, this is fantastic. But, let's think about, some quarterback coach pairings that haven't panned out. And there have been, a lot of them. I mean, whether it's Harbaugh or other guys, just for who a guy played with doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to pan out in the National Football League. And so, while that might be another, quiver, an arrow in the quiver of a GM saying, 3 years down the road, why did we draft this guy in the first round? He didn't pan out. Well, look, he fit the part. He scheme fit, coached by a quarterback coach. It might be enough to save your job if he doesn't pan out. I'm not reading too much into that because what I see sort of on tape leads me to believe that he might be a scheme-limited quarterback that might have been underwhelming at times. So if you're a vertical-based passing game, if you're a time and a rhythm-based passing game, this guy might not be the guy that you want. And so, he would probably get drafted in the first round, maybe early second would be his sort of floor in this draft. But I'm kind of as close as I would get to being out on a guy, especially if we're talking like mid-first round.
Does he seem like a guy that's maybe reached his ceiling already? Like, you got some of those guys that really have that potential. You see those throws that make you go, okay, this guy could be something. Where I guess there's times with Daniel Jones, for me at least, I feel like he's smart and you can see that, but I just don't see where he's going to take his game to that next level.
Yeah, I mean, if there are areas where if he improves his style of play, you could see him perhaps taking that kind of leap. I mean, his footwork on drops and things like that lacks any sort of semblance of structure for the most part. Now, if he perhaps cleans that up, gets crisper footwork in the pocket, that could help. He is too slow at times. Boundary blitzes were a problem for him. That dates back sort of 2 years on film. A lot of college quarterbacks, not all, but some have an issue with that. So he would need to fix that up. His accuracy, and again, this is tied to his footwork on those sort of set, reset, and throw type moments. That is spotty. Struggles with anticipation throws at times. And so if the game sort of speeds up for him, as it will need to for all of these guys, basically, you could see that potentially, clicking for him. And I'm not foreclosing that possibility. It could certainly happen, but you would need to have a quarterback coach that you certainly trust. And I don't want to say has a proven track record of developing quarterbacks, but you would at least have faith that this guy could develop him, if you're going to buy in on Daniel Jones. I mean, so there's a potential that he could, sort of extend and raise his ceiling as a quarterback. He might be banging up against it right now with the right coach. Maybe he raises that ceiling a bit, but, I think that's a good point. He might be close to a finished product given, what he's done in college. Now, he's a quarterback that I understand why he came out. It's a weak quarterback class. I understand that, look, you look back at that Duke roster, maybe they're not going to have the best talent around them next year. You open that season next year against Alabama. You probably don't want to be in that game. So I get why he came out. Yeah. But, maybe he could have been served by one more season in college. But at the same time, on the flip side of that coin, you get blown out by Alabama to start your final year in college. Maybe that's not the way you want to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And you bring up some good points about his limitations and some of the issues in his game. I'm curious, though, he is a guy that's been linked to Denver. Denver has brought in Rich Scangarello, who's running this West Coast offense. It's not the Gruden style, but it's that Kyle Shanahan, 11 personnel heavy West Coast offense. And I'm curious about your thought as a fit in that offense underneath, that Kyle Shanahan style of the zone stretch and everything like that, the under center play, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting about that is, the more Shanahan type West Coast, and, I just got done literally the past 2 days studying Nick Mullins. So, I've been studying Shanahan's playbook and things like that over the past couple of days. And so a lot of that is predicated on, moving the quarterback a bit, those rollouts, those boot action type plays, and some timing and rhythm in the passing game. But those are things that I don't really associate with Daniel Jones. If it's more the Gruden branch of the West Coast tree, I think that could work. But the timing and rhythm and movement-based West Coast type of offense that Shanahan's been known to run, which you guys are going to be running, that's a bit of more of a question mark. And sometimes when he's throwing on the move, the mechanics drip a bit, the accuracy dips a bit. Sometimes he will roll or move himself into pressure just when he's responding to protection breakdowns. And so that's not usually the best thing to associate with a quarterback that you're going to want to move around a lot. And like I said, the timing and rhythm stuff, that's not really his strength. And so the scheme fit is a bit spotty in my mind.
All right. Well, let's say, put your thinking cap on, get your crystal ball out. 5 years from now, why is Daniel Jones successful? 5 years from now, why did his pick fail?
I think if he's going to be successful, you're going to have to look at a situation where they've built some talent around him. They take a lot off his plate whenever he starts to play early, but he's in an offense that is going to do things to help speed up the mental process. And this is something that we should do, with all of these guys. But when you look at, say, how Josh McDaniels helps Tom Brady, when you look at, say, how Sean McVay helps Jared Goff, they do things to give them those pre-snap indicators, whether it's man versus zone and things like that. So they know as much information as humanly possible when they snap the football and have to make a decision. So you're going to have a coach that is really going to do the things to help his quarterback rather than just kind of say, look, this is what we're running and this is how it's going to work. And so he's going to have to find that ideal, scheme fit, landing spot, things like that, and coaching fit.
All right. Well, moving on now to the next quarterback here, another guy that's kind of had an up and down career to date. He started off at Baylor, transferred out, and then went to Auburn and played in a bizarre offense, I'd call it. It didn't really tailor to his strengths, but still some up and down, some flashes, lows as well. And talking about Jarrett Stidham, played at Auburn this past year, and he's a guy that, again, a lot of buzz coming out from the Senior Bowl that he looked really good in that Kyle Shanahan South-coached team, and then, the practices playing fine, and then the game came around, and again, some of those issues with him, being too slow in the pocket, that alarm clock's not going off. I think it was Charles Omenihu came around the backside and got a strip sack on him. So Jarrett Stidham, a guy that I've been told the Broncos do have circled, the guy that they'd be interested in, let's say, if they don't go quarterback round one. And I'm curious about your thoughts about him as a strengths and weaknesses guy and a quarterback that a lot of people had coming into this year as potential quarterback one.
Yeah, Stidham's interesting because, if you would have asked me this question, say back in August, who is a quarterback that could rise, I would have pointed to him. If they had put more on his plate, asked him to do more from, a conceptual standpoint, that he could have had the kind of season that would see him, get him his way into the first round. But that Auburn offense was not a great fit. And what's interesting about it was, I got to talk to him down in Mobile. And I asked him, what was his favorite thing to run this week? And he basically looked at me and laughed and said, all of it. Which tells me, one, he must have loved having this week behind him. And number two, he liked getting away from that Auburn offense. I don't think that really showcased what he can do. Some of the things that I like from him, the flip side of what we were just talking about with Daniel Jones, sort of timing and rhythm throws. I think that's kind of one of the things that he does best. He can actually make some anticipation throws. He can do some things in terms of progression reads. He has enough anticipation right now to make me think that he can develop that when he gets to the NFL and needs to do more of it. He's got pretty good footwork on his drops into the pocket, sufficient enough arm talent. When they ran vertical stuff, whether it's 5.85 or 5.95 or things like that, those deep comeback routes, he can make sort of those throws. And so, I think that the Senior Bowl was a good week for him. Also, conversely to Daniel Jones, because it was that more controlled environment and situation and a better offense for him. And so he's a guy that, for some people, he might be a top that second tier of quarterbacks. And I know, for example, Matt Miller has him ranked about 57 overall. And so when you get into that day 2 area, he's a quarterback that I think is probably going to go picked, maybe late second round, early third type situation. And dependent again on the right type of offense and more time-and rhythm-based offense, that could be the ideal fit for him.
Do you have some issues with his pocket moving? You said the guy on the move a little bit better there, but something that I kept coming back to watching him is he runs himself into some bad situations, and it almost is, I wouldn't say completely unaware, but the pressure around him just doesn't feel it, doesn't sense it, doesn't know exactly when to step up. Sometimes he's kind of going through the motions and you see that, but that pocket presence really was a big concern from me when I was watching him.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly an issue with him. And it's something that you wonder, can he develop it and refine it, or is it always going to be an issue? Because when you get to the NFL, obviously, you're going to have to show that you can handle pressure, that you can move around in the pocket and respond well to pressure in the pocket. And so I think when you watch him on film, you're hoping that he develops that and gets that feel for it. Because there were times, like I said, where he didn't feel backside pressure, where he drifted into the face of pressure rather than climb in the pocket. He needs to get better footwork and feel for those moments. Some quarterbacks, they can develop that. Some quarterbacks, you are who you are. And if this is who he is, it will be a problem for him in the NFL.
Yeah, for sure. And bringing it back to the Senior Bowl here, did you have any takeaway impression? He said he had a better week. I'm very curious about what you saw from him specifically in what Kyle Shanahan was trying to do in those practices.
Well, I think what stood out to me, and he was asked to do a lot more than he was at Auburn. And one of my favorite throws from any quarterback was in that Wednesday practice session where, he wasn't asked to move defenders with his eyes a ton. This is something that if you watch, like I just got done watching Nick Mullins, Nick Mullins was asked to do this a lot. When you can move that underneath a linebacker with your eyes in a 3-by-2 alignment when the backfield is empty, and move that linebacker away from the 3 receiver side, you can do good things as a quarterback. Stidham showed some of that down in Mobile. And again, he wasn't asked to do it at Auburn. And so you see things like that and you realize that there was a better quarterback inside of him that he just wasn't asked to be while he was Auburn. And so, one of the rules of scouting, one of the old saws of scouting is you scout the traits, not the scheme. So it's going to be incumbent upon people when they watch Stidham and when they do their work on them to divorce the player and the traits from the offense he was asked to run. Because if you still isolate some moments, you can see him making those anticipation throws and moving defenders with his eyes, particularly down in Mobile. And so there was a good quarterback inside of him. Now, at the same time, you can't ignore what we saw on film, and there were still some issues on film. But I think the buy-in for Stidham is going to be, look, get him some NFL coaching, get him into our offense. We can have some success with this kid because we've seen some of the traits that you're going to need to be successful at the NFL in him, whether it was at Auburn or down in Mobile for the Senior Bowl.
And just from a schematic perspective, what is it about that Auburn tape? I mean, I can't really put my finger on it exactly. It looks like an offense that's built for that quarterback to run around a little bit, some of those options where, Stidham did show he could pull it down sometimes and run it. That's not what he's going to do in the NFL. But what is it that's so unaesthetically pleasing when watching these quarterbacks?
I think it's that, there's a simplification in the route structure. And so, you might have just a 2-receiver combination to the left, whether it's, hitch, go, or something like that, or, Ohio, where it's just, go and out slot receiver runs a quick out. That coupled with all the movement they were asked and, put on his plate where, he can throw on the move and things like that, but they're really trying to get that quarterback to be sort of a stretch factor where you're trying to sort of press the edge and be a horizontal stretch, or you're trying to sort of press the line of scrimmage and be sort of a vertical stretch against the defense. That's not what he does. When you look back at him when he was at Baylor, and sort of that more, intermediate and downfield type passing game, that might have been some of his best stuff on film, even though that was simplified, but it was a different kind of offense and probably fit his skill set better. I think the fit with him was different. There are some specific plays I can point to. I'm like trying to flip through my notes because I know there were times when I literally wrote down like, what is this offense? Like it just made no sense to me, But I think getting him away from that, we saw some of it down in Mobile, I think will be a great thing for his development.
Awesome. Well, it's bringing it back to him. This is a Building the Broncos podcast. It's not just the player himself, but how you're maximizing this player, talking about scheme fit. I don't think there's a scheme transcendent quarterback in this class when it comes down to it. But what are some key areas that you're looking for that you absolutely need to build around for Stidham to be successful, whether it be a dominant X receiver that can win vertically or a tight end or, a great offensive line? What is something that you think Stidham needs to be married to if he's going to be successful personnel wise?
I think given some of the issues with responding to pressure and handling the pocket presence side and developing that part of his game, you're going to need a stout offensive line once he starts playing. Whether it's this year or a year down the road or so, whenever he starts taking over games and becomes your starting quarterback, you're going to need to have the protection sorted out because he's going to need to develop that. We just got done sort of breaking that down. I think as far as a scheme fit, I think he's pretty scheme diverse. Maybe some downfield throws that he missed dating back to Baylor, even, the past couple of years at Auburn. Maybe he's not an ideal fit for a vertical passing offense, but I think sort of the timing and rhythm-based offense would be a good fit for him. But you've got to make sure that you've got the protection stuff sorted out. You've got an offensive line that can protect him, backs that can help him pass pro and blitz pickup, tight ends that can chip and things like that. That's going to be the biggest key, I think, for him.
Awesome. Well, question we asked earlier, 5 years from now, getting out that crystal ball, what makes him successful and what would make him a failed pick?
I think learning that pocket presence, that feel for the pocket, the ability to sort of use the feet to manipulate and move and slide and create space and respond to pressure better, that's going to be the developmental key for him. If he doesn't sort of pan out, it's going to be that, not that the offense held him back at Auburn or anything like that. It's just that, the traits that we perhaps isolated from, time to time, manipulation, things like that, time and rhythm throws, they weren't really there. And he doesn't get the chance to truly develop and refine what he needs to develop and refine, and if he doesn't figure out handling pressure better, that's the big developmental thing with him. If he doesn't fix that, that's going to be a problem.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, moving on to a guy who was, I would argue, the standout quarterback from the Shrine game. Did you end up going to the Shrine Bowl as well?
I did not get to Shrine. But from talking to people that were down there, they would agree with that assessment.
Yeah. Brett Rypien from Boise State, a guy, I think the only thing that kind of came out of the whole Shrine Bowl, where the Shrine game, that was kind of like I guess you have to call it a negative, but that hand size measured in pretty small, unfortunately. But, we're nitpicking at this point, but Brett Rypien, Boise State, a guy who's won some games, seems like a West Coast style quarterback. He does make the throws. He doesn't have outstanding tools, but a guy that a lot of people have pegged as the guy to target day two, probably a higher floor than a lot of these other guys. But I'm curious about your thoughts and what you see from him from Boise State and some of his strengths and weaknesses just overall as a player.
Yeah, Nick, he's a fascinating player to watch, and what's going to be really intriguing to me over the next couple of weeks and into the draft is, does the gulf that seems to be present between the NFL and people close to the NFL and the rest of the evaluation community, whether you call it draft Twitter or anything else, does that gulf remain, or does that close, or does it even widen? Because, for example, I'm happy to be part of the Pro Football Weekly Draft magazine. Greg Gabriel, director of player personnel for the Chicago Bears for years. He's the guy that basically does all the scouting reports and stuff. Doesn't even have Brett Rypien listed. He didn't get a Senior Bowl invite. They had, for example, Trace McSorley there instead of him. So he found himself at the Shrine game. He's going to be one of those throw-in quarterbacks as well at the Combine, which typically those types of spots go to guys that are maybe fringe draftable type guys in the NFL's eyes, whether it's the size thing or things like that, the hand size, I don't know. Maybe it's an arm strength thing. Maybe teams are trying to stash them. We've heard that before where, teams don't go out and say, look, can you get this guy down to the Senior Bowl if they want to hopefully hide him a little bit. And so maybe there's something like that at play. But then you look at the evaluation community, guys over at the Draft Network, myself, other people. We've got him in our top 5. I mean, he's probably going to be quarterback 4 for me. And he's a quarterback that I first wrote about when he was a freshman. And when you study him over the arc of his career, you see a quarterback that sort of does the little things that matter. Moving defenders with his eyes. I just rewatched one of his games because I hadn't studied him for a while. I was like, am I just missing something? And it's there. The ability to sort of look defenders off. He made a couple of throws that I literally want to ask him about that almost looked like no-look throws to me. Now, I don't know if they genuinely were or not. Unfortunately, you have the end zone camera behind him, so I couldn't see his face on those moments. But they looked almost like that. One of my favorite plays from him was in their game against San Diego State. It was a game that they lost. And I love studying games where quarterbacks lose because I think you learn more about who they are as a player, as a person, as a leader, their competitive toughness. And there's a play later in that game where there's a 3rd and 10 situation in their own territory. He adjusts the protection pre-snap because he sees the blitz come and he brings the tight end in to help in protection. The blitz still doesn't get picked up. He gets drilled by the blitzer, an inside linebacker, and just drills in a perfect rope shot on a deep out pattern to move the sticks on 3rd and 10. Like, that's the stuff you got to do in the NFL from the pocket, from the pre-snap phase to the end of the play. And so he checks a lot of the non-negotiable, type boxes for me, from the pre-snap process and speed and the mental approach to the post-snap stuff, the ability to manipulate defenders' full body. You see him using shoulder fakes and pumps and things like that to get defenders out of position. Are there sort of issues with him? Yeah, I think the size one might be one. If there are teams that are rumored to be huge on hand size, for example, he might not meet their sort of analytical thresholds. Arm strength might be an issue. I think he checks those boxes. From the arm strength perspective, I think he sort of meets the threshold. You see him make some, longer throws, left hash to right sideline, for example, on those deep out patterns that get put in there with good velocity, timing, and rhythm, but it's not overpowering. And so I'm very curious to see if the NFL stays where they are and that gulf remains, or if as we get into and out of Indy, people start coming back around on him because there are still teams that go by the Parcells rules, and it's harder and harder and harder, as you guys well know, to find quarterbacks that check all those boxes because guys leave school. So you're not getting the number of starts or the number of wins or anything like that. But Joe Marino over at the Draft Network put all these quarterbacks under those rules, and Rypien was one of 2 that checked all 7 boxes. And I can tell you that one team in particular that still goes by that is the New England Patriots. And so I've been talking about Brett Rypien potentially going to New England for a long time right now. I think he would fit that kind of offense, as I'm sure we're going to talk about. But you can probably tell from the way I've talked about this kid, I'm all aboard. I'm going to probably die on Rypien Hill this year, which sounds a little weird. But I think in this draft class, and I've said this on other shows, I've said this to other people, he is the refined quarterback in a class that might lack that kind of guy. And so if that's what you're looking for, a guy that can do like the little things from the pre-snap to post-snap phase and things like that, this might be your guy.
My one big question for you on him is it seems like the games that he struggles, he really struggles. Where if he throws one interception, it usually turns into 2 or 3 in a game. He doesn't seem to have just those one interception games. It's a couple more. Is that something that really sticks out to you with him, that he just can't seem to forget that last play?
Yeah, that was one of the interesting things about studying him was you watch, for example, his bowl game last year. And I remember, they were playing Oregon, I believe, and he threw a bad pick 6 type situation. I'm like, okay, now we're going to get to see what he's made of. And he came out on the next drive and he ripped some throws. And I remember thinking, okay, well, we're checking that competitive toughness box. Cause like I said, I want to see when quarterbacks lose. I want to see them handle adversity. I want to see when they're tested, because it's one of the toughest things as a quarterback when you've made that mistake to forget it and bounce back. Some guys have the mental makeup to put that behind them and other guys don't. I was one of those guys that didn't, and for me, it's like the quicksand test. We all remember the movie The Replacements with, Shane Falco and, talking about quicksand. You make a mistake and then you make him another and you start fighting back against it. And all you're doing is making things worse. And so you're seeing Rypien after that bad interception. He's making some throws. He's ripping some throws. He's looking great. And then he makes another bad mistake. And I'm just like, well, man, this is a quicksand moment with him, which is why I sort of like that San Diego State game, because even though he made some mistakes in that game and they lost, he seemed to battle through it. But that is a concern, and that's one of the things. Look, I wrote a piece over at Inside the Pylon about the most important place in Indianapolis for all 17 quarterbacks. And I think with him, it's the interview room. And I think it's the chance to sit down with these NFL coaches and general managers and decision makers and say, I'm the veteran passer. I'm the refined passer. I'm the guy that you can plug and play right now You won't need this huge developmental curve with me, but he's going to have to answer for those moments because it is an issue. Does he have that ability to forget, to fire and forget? Because you need that as a quarterback. You can't play this position timid, scared, afraid, unsure. And if he continues to have moments like that, it's going to be an issue for him.
Yeah, for sure. I see that in his game as well. It can kind of spiral out of control. I remember that Las Vegas Bowl was the bowl game you're talking about against Oregon, where kind of a lot of anticipation with Justin Herbert. And I remember Leighton Vander Esch had just an unbelievable game in that one. Kind of put him, a lot of people were already kind of aware of him, but I remember he just dominated that one. But yeah, bringing it back to Rypien, he did have 9-inch hand size, same as Drew Lock. So maybe I'm liking those smaller-handed quarterbacks this year. I guess that's just how it's turning out. But I'm curious about your overall thoughts with him as far as scheme fit. Is he a guy that you think is better in that Patriot style, the Earhart-Perkins style offense, or is he a guy that you think he can move around a little bit, throw it off base, run that zone stretch, and be a fit for that zone stretch offense that Kyle Shanahan and that Kyle Shanahan West Coast offense that Rick Scangarello's promised to bring?
Yeah, I mean, I think he could fit in that kind of offense because he can throw pretty well on the move. Very good, veteran type player, coach's son type of kid. Obviously we know who his uncle was. So he's got that ability where he does the things that you need to do, the carrying out ball fakes and the little things like that. One of the things I really like about him. I think he could work in that sort of Aaron Perkins, New England sort of time and a rhythm-based offense. I think he could be a West Coast type quarterback, the more traditional Gruden style. I think those offensive systems work best for him. If you're somebody that is sort of old school and you like to see the quarterback line up under center and take the deep drop or, work the perfect crisp 3, 5, 7-foot drop, 7-step drop, he can give you that. He can give you the play action with the back to the defense. I mean, the first play I ever wrote about him back when he was a freshman was a fake fumble play where he literally took the snap. It looked like he was picking the ball up off of the ground and then threw a deep post route for a touchdown. He could do some of those little things. The vertical passing game is not his strength. And I don't think it's a placement, a general accuracy issue more than anything else. So Bruce Arians is not going to have him on his board. I would be stunned. I've seen some crazy things in my day. I've seen a grown man satisfy a camel, but seeing Bruce Arians draft Brett Rypien would be the stunner of all stunners. So, that would blow my mind because I don't think he's that type of quarterback. But the other kinds of offensive systems I think would be something that he could run and operate fairly early in his career. I mean, he's a guy that I think could take over as a second-year quarterback and start in the NFL.
I like that dodgeball reference there.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. Mark, can I get you to talk about something? It's not just Brett Rypien specific. You had mentioned something, and I wanted you to have this opportunity with some of our listeners because this is something we've ran into with some other quarterbacks that we've talked about in that deep ball accuracy. And I've had many of them throw stats, not our listeners, but others that have thrown stats and say, well, look at this. This guy he's completed quite a few passes down the field, but that doesn't always make him a great deep ball passer. Can you kind of explain the difference between the stats showing it compared to what you actually see on tape?
Yeah. And, when you talk about sort of accuracy, I always break down when I'm studying a quarterback, short accuracy, intermediate accuracy, deep accuracy. And there's a difference between completion percentage, general accuracy, and ball placement. You can complete 95% of your throws, but be an inaccurate or a poor quarterback when it comes to terms of ball placement. Because let's take an example. You're throwing that quick hitch route to the slot receiver, say on a stick type concept. And if you make the receiver adjust awkwardly for that, or if you sort of lead him into the defender as opposed to away from him, that may be caught. It may be perhaps a generally accurate throw, but it's poorly placed. And the deeper you sort of get down the field, the less I'm more concerned about like great placement. Like if you're throwing a 50-yard go route, I don't need you to put it to the perfect hip or shoulder or anything like that. I'm looking more for general accuracy. But when you're getting closer and closer to the line of scrimmage, I'm paying particular attention to, are you putting the ball in the optimum place given the leverage from the nearest defender, the coverage situation, the route concept, piecing that all together. And so there is a difference between sort of completion percentage and ball placement. Like I said, you can complete 60, 70, 80% of your throws, but if you're making the receivers continually adjust, it's a poorly placed throw. When you see a receiver get yardage after the catch, particularly on throws in that 0 to 20 yard range, it is largely because of the quarterback. And I'm not saying that as a former quarterback, but if you can combine the anticipation and the correct ball placement, you are going to put your receiver in a position to win after the catch. And that's your job as a quarterback. Your job isn't just to complete the throw and then go smile for the cameras. Your job is to go help your guy get 6 and make a house call. And so if you're leading the guy away from the nearest defender, if you lead him away from danger, and sometimes good placed throws, well placed throws look bad when you first see them. For example, go back to, say, Brian Billick's old Baltimore Ravens playbook from like 1994 or something like that. And you look at how he coaches his quarterbacks to throw the slant route. He tells them to throw it as low as necessary. Why? Because when you're coming over the middle like that, if you leave it high, you're going to get your guy killed. Yeah. And so when you sometimes see a receiver have to go to the ground on a throw over the middle or near traffic, that's a well-placed throw in many occasions because that's what they're taught to do. And so the difference between sort of general accuracy and completion percentage ball placement, that's a huge one. And, sometimes I struggle with it because I'll find myself, like I did today, rewinded a couple of different plays with Brett Rypien on one was a deep ball against Colorado State. Was this generally accurate or not? And so, it takes some time and sometimes I screw it up, but that's kind of how I view them. The difference between sort of general accuracy down the field, you can guy throw a consistent catchable ball. And the closer you get to the line of scrimmage, is he putting his receiver in the best position to succeed after the catch? Because that yardage after the catch, that's your job. And if you're not helping your guy get that, then you're not doing your job as a quarterback.
Well, speaking about general accuracy and everything like that, guys that are maybe not the most consistent in that regard, Will Grier, West Virginia, and he's a guy, the season started, a lot of people had him in contention with a first-round quarterback. He put up the big stats, Big 12 offense, West Virginia, got the long hair, kind of a high-profile guy as well coming from Florida. But I'm curious about your thoughts on him because I feel like he's one of the more – just the contrarian opinions galore. Some people really like him and some people are, think he is absolutely terrible. Some people think he's a day 3 quarterback. Some people say he could go to the end of round 1. So I'm curious about your thoughts about his skill set. And, you're talking about the general accuracy and stuff. That's something that I have a lot of questions regarding Will Grier. How much of that is the quarterback's accuracy versus the schematic openings that he's taken advantage of?
Yeah, this has been such a fascinating quarterback class to study, and he is near the top of the fascinating sort of test cases we've got at our disposal here because there are times when you're like, put the pen down. This is QB1. Like, this is that kind of guy. He can make some throws over the middle of the field between the numbers, between the hash marks that other quarterbacks in this class aren't even going to try, and the best way to sort of sum up Will Grier, I think, was after practice on Tuesday down at the Senior Bowl when he got tied up. He couldn't make his podium session before the practices started at the media day event. And so he, talked to everybody he could after that first practice, had the assembled media around him, and he looked everybody dead in the eyes like, I'm the best quarterback in this class. I've got the best arm in this class. Ask anybody I played against. Ask anybody I played with going back to Florida. You're darn right. Of course I'm throwing at the combine. Like, it's like for the Top Gun fans out there, like, yeah, that's mighty arrogant considering the company you're in, but I kind of like that in a pilot or a quarterback. You can't play this position scared. He certainly does not lack confidence. He's got that like balance of aggression that for the most part is appropriate, where you see him challenge some windows that other guys are going to shy away from. But that being said, he can make some head scratchers of decisions, man. I mean, he had, back-to-back plays against Baylor, for example, where he missed some throws, made some curious decisions. He had a goal line pick against Kansas on a tosser concept where it was just like, man, what are you thinking? Like, what? It was a put the pen down moment in the wrong kind of way. But where I sort of come back to him is this. Look, when you're talking about quarterbacks, the toughest thing to do to get a quarterback to do, and I know we're going to get into it, I think, with the next guy, is to get a quarterback to be more aggressive. You can always get a guy to sort of dial it back a bit, say, look, man, you saw what just happened. Don't do that again. but it's hard to get a guy to be more aggressive. It's hard to get a guy to take more risks. If you're generally a risk-averse guy, you're not going to change that. But if you're a daredevil, you can tap that down a little bit. And so I think Grier, I don't want to say he's like Patrick Mahomes. I don't want to make a Patrick Mahomes comparison. But in studying Patrick Mahomes, you watched him in college at Texas Tech. You're like, yeah, he takes some risks. But if he learns to dial that back just a little bit, he's got something to him. I think Grier is a quarterback in that similar mold where if he dials some things back, I think there's that proper balance of aggression I think could work in his favor. He's like the ugly duckling of this group too. It kind of looks like a mess at times. The footwork's all over the place. The mechanics in the upper body are kind of all over the place. Sometimes he misses on throws that he should hit. And so there's some inconsistency there. And so the biggest thing for him from me, from where I'm watching him, is can he be consistent in the NFL and balancing everything he needs to do? I still like him. I don't think he's a round one quarterback. I think he's sort of that mid, second round type guy, but that puts him near the top of the board in this draft class. Let's face it. And so I like him. I think there are some offenses that he could work in. I do wonder about the consistency at the next level.
You're the second guest actually that we've had on here that talked about that, of you'd rather have an aggressive guy that you have to tell to dial it back than a guy that you have to tell be more aggressive. And I agree with you. I mean, that's always, it's easier. It's kind of, my dad always said when he was teaching, it's always easy to start out tough and get easier on the kids than to start out easy and get tough on them, because they'll just run all over you. And I agree with you with Will Grier here. I guess now you said there at the Senior Bowl, you saw a lot of things, the footwork and some different things. Any other impressions? I know I watched the game at least, and the game was a mess. Yeah. I mean, there were so many throws that should have been intercepted that he had guys kind of bail him out, and I don't even know how some of that stuff worked out in his favor. But what did you think other than that there at the Senior Bowl with him?
I mean, look, his Senior Bowl week on the field was not good. No, he struggled at times. His most memorable play from the game itself was basically a YOLO deep ball that Hunter Renfrow came down with and won at the catch point. And that's kind of perhaps Will Grier in a nutshell, that sometimes he would just take some risks and, put his guys, or at least try to put his guys in a position to go make a play. Like I said, ball security is going to be an issue with him as well. He seemed to be getting better at that. When I was watching him last summer, it was like, man, you got to tuck the ball, you got to protect the ball, things like that. He seemed to be learning that. He seemed to be developing that sort of skill set, which I know sounds weird. Like, why are we talking about, securing the ball when you're scrambling? Because it shows you that he's at least cognizant of some of his flaws. And that gets to the sort of coachability standpoint. And he's going to need to get coached up for a lot of the reasons we talked about. But if he seems sort of receptive to it now, he'll probably take to it when he's a professional. And so I think that, there's a path for him to be successful, but it's going to take that sort of consistency and some true refinement to his game to get there.
So what are you doing to build around him to be successful then?
I think you're going to need some receivers that can win, at the catch point and downfield, because he's got that inconsistency in the vertical passing game. He would take some of those risks. So you're going to need some guys that can be strong at the catch point. With the other guys, we talked about protecting them. I'm more worried about protecting them, not in the pocket, but down the field. That's where I think he needs his protection. And so I want a strong receiving core. I want a tight end that can win on 3rd and 7. Like, those are the things that I'm going to want for Will Grier when he starts taking snaps in live action in the NFL.
And I have one last question before we move on to Ryan Finley here. Will Grier is going to be set to be 24 years old, I believe, when the draft actually comes around. Does that matter so much for you for a quarterback? There's been some guys in the past drafted a little bit older, and that's kind of been a risk aversion from teams. So does Will Grier being 24 matter? Is there kind of a threshold age that you look for? Or does it just, another talking point that you think doesn't really matter so much in the NFL?
Yeah, I mean, I'm more in the talking point bucket here than anything else. He's married with a kid, and that, that has some pros and some cons to it too. I mean, you won't have a situation like, I don't want to bring up Paxton Lynch, but he's going to go home to the wife and kid at night. He's not going to log on and play Fortnite for 10 hours or whatever. And so, I think there are some bonuses with that. It shows that, he's learned from some real life experiences. In the Florida situation, obviously, married with a kid and things like that, that will anchor you as a human being. That you will grow and mature as a result. And so with him, I think it's kind of a plus.
All right. Well, moving along now, we got another quarterback that we wanted to highlight here before we moved on to some Flacco talk. But Ryan Finley, a guy that he's kind of had a solid career at North Carolina State, chugging along, had some fun weapons there as well. A guy that played pretty well in the Senior Bowl, and a guy that, he just screams 10-year backup. Doesn't really have the traits, doesn't really have many outstanding, just oomph in the arm talent, but he moves the offense, he moves the ball, he tends to make the right read. And I think that, if you were a team that was looking for a safe backup kind of guy that you think you can develop and be cheap there, he'd be one you'd look for. Now, are you drafting a quarterback that you are looking to be a backup type? That's another debate to have entirely, but I'm curious about your thoughts on North Carolina State quarterback Ryan Finley.
Yeah, he's another interesting study in the sense that, he's another guy that checks all 7 of those Parcells buckets. He checks those Parcells rules like Brett Rypien, like we were just talking about with him. I think from a mental standpoint, I like some of what he does. Now, he's sort of seems to be a film tape type nerd. I was talking to him about some, route concepts and stuff like that. And you could tell, his eyes lit up when I was talking about one of their passing designs. We've got a trips look with a post, an out and up from number 2, and then an out route from number 3. And he's talking about how they would love to get number 3 isolated on a linebacker. He loved throwing that out route to number 3 with timing and rhythm and stuff like that. And so he gets it from a mental standpoint. His game against Syracuse, one of my favorite games from any of these quarterbacks. Syracuse spun their safeties a ton at the snap, and so it put a lot on his plate from a mental perspective, and he seemed to get it and figure it out. And a lot of that pre-snap to post-snap look type stuff, he figured it out and diagnosed it. And so I think, like you just said, like you teed it up, he screams 10-year backup. He screams like Colt McCoy type guy that we're going to be talking about 10 years from now. They're like, oh, he's still kicking around. That's interesting. Maybe he could develop into something more than that, but he's got a really nice floor to him. I think he sort of fits that timing and rhythm type of offense, similar to what he was doing at NC State. I think there are going to be teams that like him. I think the Patriots are going to like him. And so, when you get into that, probably early day 3 type range, if you're a team that, maybe has a quarterback now, but might want to protect yourself for the next year or 2 down the road and maybe see what you get, he's a guy that you should think about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think he's probably not so much in play for the Broncos, all things considered, but you never know. If you got to take that quarterback and he ends up being the guy that matches personality wise, that happens in the league. So there's a few other guys here. We're running a little long. Such great insight from you. I never want to stop you. And I wish we could talk for another 3 hours. Maybe you'll get you back on before the draft again. But there's some other quarterbacks here that we won't break them down as much as we did here. But the Jordan Ta'amu from Ole Miss, Tyree Jackson from Buffalo, Clayton Thorson from Northwestern, a guy that I keep seeing people say, hey, he's going to be taken day 2. And it seems like you're talking about that disconnect between the media and the league. With Brett Rypien, that seems to be another one that has some disconnect the other way around where the league is higher on him. And a guy like Eric Dungey at Syracuse. Any of these guys stand out to you? Ones that you could see being maybe West Coast guys, or ones that you see high upside, attainable upside that can eventually be a guy that you can build a team around maybe, or even just squeeze some value out of him as a spot starter.
Yeah, I think a guy that might fit that sort of lottery ticket type mold would be Tyree Jackson. Has the hammer. Has an absolute cannon for an arm. And he's every bit of 6'7". He's a big, tall quarterback with some athleticism to him. Needs to get faster. His lower body mechanics are a mess. He's very raw, but can make some wow, jaw-dropping type throws. So, he's somebody that, again, if you've got an established quarterback and you don't need somebody right away, you take a flyer on him and maybe, you turn that lottery ticket into something huge. And so he's going to be a fun name to watch where he goes. Thorson's interesting. I was curious to see if he ended up down in Mobile, how he would have looked. I think he has issues with pressure and responded to pressure, but that might have stemmed from the knee injury. So, maybe there's something there. I'm not that excited about him. Maybe the league does like him, but like you said, with the draft community, not a huge fan. Dungey's interesting. He's more of that undrafted free agent type guy, but we've seen it happen before. One of those guys gets into a camp and, they kind of get a chance to show some things and work with the threes and make some noise come, third or fourth, preseason game, he might be a sort of schematic fit for Denver, but I don't think he's the right sort of mold to go down. I think Denver's probably going to address quarterback before, say, round 7. So I don't know if he'd be the best name to sort of spend too much time on. Tamo's interesting. That was a vertical-based offense. His game against Southern Illinois was a ton of fun to watch, but then he made some head-scratching decisions later in the season. That offense was kind of limited. I think they ran like 10 different plays, but I think a guy like Bruce Arians might like him. He has some downfield type ability. Easton Stick might be an interesting name. He would be a good scheme fit. Again, he's more that day 3 type guy. So maybe it's not Denver where they would go, but I think he's an interesting guy to sort of watch for a West Coast type offense. Arm talent might be a question. He could run, man, he loves throwing 4 verticals, those inside seam routes, loves doing stuff like that. So those are some names I would throw out in this sort of other category, those day 3 type guys.
Honestly, given the Broncos' issues at quarterbacks over the last few years, I am all about using that Redskins method. If you go get your guy round 1, go get another one day 3. I don't even care.
There are worse ways to go.
Yeah, the shotgun approach.
Yeah,
they're lottery tickets, so you might as well buy a couple extra. If they're cheaper, if there's a guy that kind of fits, you kind of groove with, go for it. Because until, again, like we said at the beginning of the episode, until you get that quarterback fixed, man, you're not really going anywhere in today's NFL. Now we're going to take another quick break. Oops, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, well, you also have Scangarello and his ability to find Nick Mullins, where he just found a guy that he clicked with in those late area. I mean, that makes sense again. Just say, hey, you go find a guy that you really like, we'll get him for you.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, we're going to take a quick break again here, and we'll be right back with Mark Schofield to talk about Joe Flacco and what he brings to the Denver Broncos next season.
This is the Overtime Podcast Network.
All right, well, we're back again here with Mark Schofield, and we talked a lot of draft prospects. We didn't even talk about Drew Lock, Dwayne Haskins, or Kyler Murray, so if you got some fatigue with that, maybe we'll have to get Mark on here again, because those are the big 3. Curious to see what goes on with them at the Combine, but big news that's happened over the past few weeks for the Denver Broncos. John Elway makes a move for another veteran quarterback, a guy that has a Super Bowl MVP in his name, and a guy that some people call #elite. We'll see about that down here in Denver, but Joe Flacco, big quarterback, a guy that's been known to have a big arm. Maybe the downfield passing is not the same as it used to be early on, but again, it's the guy who's won a Super Bowl. It's a guy who's been on some winning teams, a veteran, and apparently a guy that Rich Scangarello liked for the Broncos over Case Keenum from everything that we've heard. So I'm curious, Mark, from you being a quarterback guy, a scheme guy as well, not only just knowing the traits and everything, but the X's and O's about this Joe Flacco trade. Did it make sense at the time, the fit, the upside, the downside, all of that stuff. So I guess starting at the top, what do you think about Joe Flacco at this point in his career for the Denver Broncos?
I mean, when this trade first came down, your initial thought is, look, you've got Case Keenum. Flacco brings the big contract with him into a sense. You're obviously going to still want to address quarterback. Is Flacco that much of an upgrade at this point of his career over Case Keenum to justify the expense? Now, he might be. Case Keenum certainly struggled at times last year. And so you do wonder about that from that standpoint. But when you look at the sort of scheme fit, I think that aspect to it makes sense, because you look at kind of when Flacco was at his best. It's in that sort of Kubiak type boot action, outside zone, stretch zone type stuff that we anticipate Denver to be running, in the year to come. And so I think the scheme fit makes sense, particularly look, if John Elway had decided that, as opposed to sort of last year, we've got like 1 quarterback, 2 quarterbacks maybe that we like in this draft class. Maybe neither one of them will be ready next year. We're going to have a guy that can give us something better at the quarterback spot. Go get that guy. Like, I get it. Like we spent so much time talking about at the beginning of the show, you got to get it right. And so I sort of understand from a scheme fit perspective, and maybe looking at this draft class thinking, we've got to make sure we've at least got a guy, and they've at least got Flacco, who will make sense from a scheme fit perspective. You've got to put some help around him. I think you're going to need some good tight ends around him. You're going to need a couple of receivers that can get open and work themselves free, but I think it could work. It's not the craziest thing we've ever seen work out in the league before. And so I think it makes sense given the scheme fit situation.
All right, and you talked about his ability under that Gary Kubiak offense and it being probably his best statistical year recently, because he's kind of been that downward trend. It's not totally his fault. The weapons in Baltimore haven't been great, but I'm curious, what about that season under Gary Kubiak that really made Joe Flacco just have a statistical outlier season and be so much more successful compared to what he's been over the last few seasons?
Well, I think when you sort of piece it together, you saw the ability to get him moving, use his athleticism, get him around the pocket, get him around the corner, get him to the edge and things like that. Use a pair of tight ends that can mirror him, those sort of waggle concepts where you've got, one under, one over type of things. This is, before he was the guy in San Francisco, Kyle Juszczyk with Gary Kubiak in Baltimore, he was a big part of their offense. And so you look at Denver, they've got a guy that could sort of fit in that mold with the fullback spot. And so, you can envision a situation where this offense is going to really look like what Flacco was doing, with Gary Kubiak in that 2014 season. They could piece together some stuff from the tight ends. When you've got the fullback that you've got in Janovich, you've got the ability with Lindsey and the way he runs that outside zone game. You can see them, showing you that stretch zone, booting back, and when you get some production with the tight end, maybe they address tight end because of the offense that you expect them to be running and what's going to be a good tight end class. Maybe that Dax Raymond kid, sometime on day 3, there's some nice tight ends deep in this draft as well. You could see this working with sort of a, you get 75, 80, 85% of what Flacco did in 2014 with similar types of pieces around him. It could work.
I think you even saw some of that this last year where he had Mark Andrews.
Yeah.
And in those first 8 games, I think Mark Andrews had plays that went for 20 yards or more in 5 of the 8 games. And just showed if he can have that explosive tight end to really work the seams and work the middle of the field, man, that offense can actually turn into something a little bit more. Yeah, and he's not the perfect quarterback by any means, but you get him a couple weapons and he can at least do enough to keep you in games.
Right. And one of the fascinating things that I get to see both from the scouting and evaluation side as well as covering the Patriots is sort of how scouting is supposed to be done, whether it's college scouting or pro scouting. One of the great things about the Patriots and the way they're able to sort of reload year after year is they ask the right questions when they're looking at who they're going to acquire, whether via the draft or via free agency. The question is always, what can he do? Too many times us in the draft Twitter world or even, people that are doing it on the big stage, they focus on what a guy can't do. Maybe right now, Joe Flacco isn't the guy to throw a great deep ball. Maybe he's not the guy that can be overly athletic like he used to be prior to the knee injury. But what can he do? He could still give you some of that stuff he was doing in Kubiak's system. And so you identify what a player can still do, and you find a way, either to make that work, you find a way to build around that, especially at the quarterback position. And so if that's the plan, to identify what he could still do as a quarterback and then build an offense around that, I think this, again, I keep saying it could work out. And so we're going to see if the Broncos are going to be in that mold of New England, sort of identifying what a player can still do and finding a way to make that work for them. Because if you get, like I said, 75, 80% of what you get from that 2014 season, that might be enough. Now, look, you're in the AFC West. You've obviously got Mahomes and company, Rivers and company. They, many people thought they shouldn't have been playing 2 road games, but that's the way the cookie crumbles. So you've got 2 teams that you're going to be chasing down. Maybe Oakland reloads. And so you do sort of wonder about what kind of season you can truly have. But from an offensive schematic production standpoint, I think if you get the right pieces, make sure you figure out the tight end position. That's going to be huge. You've got the running back to build around. You can do some stuff with the fullback and that 21 2-back personnel type packages. That was another thing huge with Kyle Shanahan. If Skaggs has learned anything from him, it's going to be using personnel to dictate. You go 21, 12, 22 personnel, get base defenses on the field, and then get tight ends and fullbacks that will be some mismatch type weapons. That's the sort of recipe to Denver having a successful offense next year with Joe Flacco. Yeah, it's definitely exciting. I was a guy that was never super keen on the Keenum signing. I thought he was limited in ways, and I do think that, you could have put an offense that married him better to the scheme. That Musgraves offense that throwing it down the field, the limited play action didn't really bring out the best of Keenum. Honestly, probably would have been a little better fit in this offense in retrospect. But what can you do? It's Flacco full steam ahead for 2019. And I'm curious, this is going to throw it out here, not on the outline. Is there a quarterback in this draft that you would pair with Flacco? And given his contract, it's easy to get out of if they don't renegotiate it, no dead money.
Is there a guy that you would like to see behind him that you think could groom into something that fits both kind of what Flacco's doing, but also what you envision with the Broncos with Kyle Shanahan? It's the Kyle Shanahan style offense with Rick Scangarello.
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. I mean, I think you can make a case for Haskins. He's not the most mobile guy, but I think, he's a guy that's going to have to sort of win with the ability to make people miss in the pocket and not make people miss in the, change of direction, Lamar Jackson kind of way, but to use his feet to slide, to move, to create space. I think Drew Lock could work in this type of offense. I think you saw some of that start under Dooley last year, that transition from what was basically Baylor's offense with a lot of, 0 routes and 9 routes and 2 routes and smoke screens to an offense that's going to be more pro-friendly. So I think Drew Lock could work. Obviously I'm going to make a case for Brett Rypien. Might not get people excited, but I think, Rypien's a quarterback that would scheme diverse, so that could work as well if you wanted to say wait, round 3, round 4, that kind of thing. And then there's the Kyler Murray X factor. I think somebody's going to draft him, and he's one of those guys that is going to get people fired either way. Like, we don't know how it's going to pan out. Most important place, you could sell his way in on pay-per-view, and people will pay $49.99 to watch it because it's going to be fascinating to see. He could work. He's got the athleticism to run some of this stuff that we've been talking about, throws really well on the move. If he comes in at 5'9" and 7/8, and, we're hearing maybe 206, okay, that would be good. But 5'9" and 7/8 is going to get some people shaky. Maybe it gets John Elway shaky. So that's going to be interesting to see. There are a number of quarterbacks I think could make it work. It'll be interesting to see which direction Elway goes in.
All right, well, that's going to wrap up this episode of Building the Broncos, powered by Overtime Media. You can find Carl on Twitter at Carl Dumler MHH and myself at Nick Kendell MHH. Also, make sure you follow Mark on Twitter at Mark Schofield. That's SCHOFIELD. No relation to Michael Schofield, who was the Broncos tackle there for a while, at least as far as I know. Right, Mark?
No relation.
Okay. Yeah, otherwise you probably would have felt that baptism that Khalil Mack gave him a few years ago.
Right.
And also make sure you check out his work at Football Outsiders and elsewhere. Head on over to Mile High Huddle, an affiliate of 24/7 Sports and CBS Sports Digital, to find more content covering the Denver Broncos. Head on over to iTunes and leave us a 5-star rating and a comment. Your support can help us continue to bring you our Denver Bronco deep dives. You can follow the Building the Broncos podcast and all our other great audio content by subscribing to the Huddle Up podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. You can follow us on Twitter at Mile High Huddle and at BTB Football Pod. For Carl and Mark, I'm Nick, wrapping up another episode of the Building the Broncos podcast. We hope you enjoyed it, and we will see you soon. Go Broncos.
You've been listening to Building the Broncos. Join Broncos Country's deep divers at milehighhuddle.com to keep the conversation going.